another in the Center's ongoing series on terrorism and homeland security issues that we co-sponsor with Georgetown University's Center for Peace and Security Studies. And the co-chair of the series is Professor Bruce Hoffman of Georgetown University. Delighted to welcome you to today's luncheon, which is be a discussion of an important recent book, Why Civil Resistance Works, The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict. We're delighted the authors, Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan, could be with us today. This series has featured kind of a variety of speakers, some from overseas, providing foreign perspectives on topical issues. We've had government officials, but I think another niche we've been trying to fill through this series is to create a forum for kind of the leading recent scholarship by, in particular, the up-and-coming, scholars and of increasing preeminence, and we have two of them here today, in Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan. So with that, let me turn the floor over to co-chair Bruce Hoffman, who will tee up today's topic and will introduce more fully our speakers. But thank you for being here today.
Thanks, Robin. Thank you all for coming. The older I get, December used to be a really quiet period in Washington, but when I had more hair, it seemed quieter than it is today. I know we're competing against the Jamestown Foundation's annual terrorism conference and also an event on the Arab Spring at Brookings, so thank you all for coming. It's a great pleasure to introduce both Dr. Maria Stefan and Dr. Erica Chenoweth, not least because their book, which is extraordinarily timely and indeed was very perspicacious, is published by the series at Columbia University Press that I edit on terrorism and irregular warfare. So I'd urge you, it's available now, to please, if you're interested in the talk, to also go out and purchase it. It's really a great pleasure to welcome two extremely talented young scholars here. Dr. Stefan is currently with the State Department, and I have to emphasize that our remarks today reflect her perhaps former status or equal status as an academician, not as an employee of the United States government, so therefore her views are those of herself only and do not reflect any positions or views taken by the United States government. She obtains her PhD from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. She's been a recipient of both Truman and Fulbright fellowships, both extremely impressive. She's previously worked in the Office of the Secretary of Defense for European and NATO issues. Her expertise is in international security, international negotiation and conflict resolution, and human rights. Dr. Chenoweth is currently an assistant professor at Wesleyan University, and there, as many of you will know, she's had enormous shoes to fill. Martha Crenshaw was, of course, at Wesleyan for decades and is probably the preeminent terrorism scholar of multiple generations, mine, and I suspect Erica's as well. Erica is already off to a tremendous start, not only with the publication of this book, but I think you have two other books in the pipeline for Columbia, which is a remarkably impressive output. She's a graduate of the University of Colorado, where she obtained her MA and PhD, and she has a BA in political science and German from the University of Dayton. So thank you very much for coming. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Bruce. Mind if I stand and just talk without the microphone? You all hear me?
Does that work?
That doesn't work for that.
In terms
okay.
Of, no, but
oh. Okay, great. Just heard that out before.
Test.
Great. Thanks, everybody, for coming and for your kind introduction. I want to just start the talk by giving you a little bit of background as to how this project started, because sometimes I think that helps to understand the overall motivation. So I was finishing my PhD thesis at the University of Colorado in the summer of 2006. I was writing on the phenomenon of terrorism that occurs more in democratic countries than non-democratic countries. And I was a real kind of guns and bombs, traditional security studies skeptic of anything that had the word peaceful or nonviolent describing a word after it. So I got this invitation to this workshop called People, Power, and Pedagogy that was going on at nearby Colorado College, which is in a really nice part of the state. And somebody pointed out to me that as a graduate student, it said free on it if you get in. So I applied. And Maria at the time was working for the agency that was putting on this workshop, the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. She was working as their kind of academic outreach coordinator and director of educational initiatives. And so that's where we met, and basically I spent the next week playing the devil's advocate about why civil resistance cannot work at this workshop that was trying to show us, or at least gently persuade us security studies scholars, that civil resistance could work. So let me give you just the concept of civil resistance. So civil resistance is a type of active conflict where unarmed civilians actually prosecute a conflict against usually a state opponent using a variety of tactics like strikes, protests, boycotts, stay-aways, go-slows, and a number of other methods without actually harming or threatening to physically harm the opponent. And so there were a number of different readings that we were supposed to do in preparation for this workshop by people like Gene Sharp and Kurt Schock and Peter Ackerman and Jack Duvall and Maria herself and others that was making the claim that nonviolent resistance in many cases could be a strategically superior coercive tactic than violent insurgency. So there were persuasive cases, but as I said, I was a skeptic. And so we sort of went back and forth throughout the workshop, and at the end, what was clear was that somebody needed to actually systematically study whether, in fact, nonviolent civil resistance could outperform violent insurgency in terms of its strategic effectiveness. So Maria and I put our heads together, and the project that we're going to talk about today is basically the output. So the reason why this study was important to do is that in much of the security studies literature, there's this assumption, either implicit or explicit, that violence happens because it's effective. It's an effective tool, that people are rational actors who exhaust all other alternatives and only use very extreme methods of political action when they have to. So when you see violence, it's because usually it's the last resort, and because it's somebody somewhere has made a judgment that it's the best way to get what they want, essentially. So this is really evident in a number of really important works on violent insurgency. And in fact, there were some scholars in the mid-2000s who were even making claims, like Robert Pape, that when different non-state actors used even more violent methods, that is, they got even more extreme in the types of methods that they used, like with suicide missions, they were even more effective. So the hypothesis that existed was the more violence, the better in terms of extracting concessions or bringing about outcomes if you're a non-state actor. And even skeptics of these types of arguments, like Max Abrams in his article, Why Terrorism Does Not Work, says on the last page of his article that, you know, even though terrorism is pretty ineffective, it's probably still more effective than nonviolent resistance. So even among people that think violence doesn't work, they think that it's still happening because it's better under the circumstances than nonviolent resistance. And then, of course, there's this other assumption out there that there are certain types of demands, like maximal goals, like regime change or anti-occupation or secession, that are just too difficult to achieve short of using violence, that people simply cannot get states to give them what they want under certain circumstances if what they're asking for is very dramatic. So this leads to 3 empirical questions, which is what we undertake in this study. The first is the simple question of which type of conflict actually works better, violent insurgency by non-state actors or unarmed civil resistance. The second question that's very important is that because we know that in many cases nonviolent resistance doesn't work, the question is why? Why does it work sometimes and not other times? And then, of course, there's the third question, which is in situations where violent insurgency succeeds, which we know sometimes it does, what are the costs? What does that do to a country, and is it really worth it in the long run? So in order to answer these questions, what we did was started out with this massive data collection effort because we were looking at very particular types of phenomena, and we wanted to make sure we were comparing apples to apples and not apples to oranges. So we started with a very strict definition of the cases of violent conflict. And what we did was go to the Correlates of War data set, where they have conflicts that occur within states, intra-state conflicts, that are armed between 2 or more armed actors, and extra-state conflicts, which can sometimes involve a foreign occupation in another country, but always having an armed uprising against it. And you have to have at least 1,000 battle deaths to be counted in these cases. So any of the correlates of war intrastate conflicts that were for things other than anti-government, anti-occupation, or secession, we actually removed from the data set. So we're left with these 3 difficult types of demands of armed conflict. So then we looked for the correlates of nonviolent conflict data set and found that there actually wasn't a correlates of nonviolent conflict data set, which was really disappointing because that means that we actually had to develop it. And there's typically a lot of skepticism from people about how one goes about doing this. So what we did was we just started with a fundamental literature review where we looked at pretty much everything that had ever been written on nonviolent conflict in search of cases. So fortunately for us, there had been a timely bibliography released about basically nonviolent conflict from the late 19th century through the present, written by Carter, Clark, and Randall. And they included a huge number of readings even about many failed nonviolent campaigns. So we applied this strict criteria to nonviolent campaigns. What we were looking for are cases where there were these civilians prosecuting an unarmed conflict against a state opponent for one of these 3 demands: regime change, anti-occupation, or secession. So civil rights campaigns are out, gender rights campaigns are out, environmental rights, economic rights. We didn't look at those. We were just looking at these hard cases. The second thing that they had to have was at least 1,000 visible participants who were engaged in a series of coordinated, linked tactics. In other words, 400,000 people showing up one day to protest and then going home is not civil resistance. It's not coordinated, and it's not repetitive. So there had to be some kind of iterated actions that were linked over time, usually by some kind of collective strategic leadership. So those were the conditions that we thought made these cases the most analogous to these violent insurgencies that we were looking at. So once we had this preliminary list, we sent it out to dozens and dozens of people around the world and asked them to analyze the cases, to let us know whether we left any out, especially the failed ones, which would be the biggest risk. And we got a lot of feedback, and we also asked them to rank them. We asked them to identify them as successes or failures. We got back a lot of feedback saying you have to have a partial success category as well, because sometimes you achieve a lot, but not quite all of what you said. But actually in our book, we refer only to complete successes, meaning the removal of a government, the expulsion of a foreign military occupation, or a full secession, not just autonomy. Because, again, we wanted to apply the strictest criteria, myself being a skeptic, thinking that these violent campaigns are going to blow the nonviolent ones out of the water, right? Well, actually, when we did the analysis, we find shockingly that the nonviolent campaigns during the series from 1900 to 2006 outperformed violent campaigns by over 2 to 1. So they're more than twice as effective. They're also twice as likely to be partially successful, meaning they achieved major strategic concessions. Either they forced a dictator to hold competitive elections instead of just completely removing them, or they did achieve significant territorial autonomy. But as I said, in all of the actual data analysis, we only count this as a success, and we count the partial successes as failures. And what you can see here is that violent campaigns are much more likely to fail outright. Now, another very striking trend is that these patterns are increasing over time, where over the past 40 years, we've been seeing a dramatic increase in the effectiveness of nonviolent resistance and a dramatic increase in the ineffectiveness of violent resistance. So for a person like me, not so much for Maria, but maybe Maria, but for both of us, this was the fact that this was so stunningly divergent in terms of outcomes leads us to this important puzzle, which is why has civil resistance worked so often relative to armed struggle? And with that, I'm going to give Maria the floor.
Great. So does this one, my Oprah skills are not as refined as Erica, so I think I'll stay seated. So the essence of our argument is looking at the importance of participation in violent and nonviolent movements. And we found that nonviolent campaigns are consistently associated with higher levels of membership, even when you're controlling for population size of the country. And so nonviolent resistance has a far greater potential than compared to violent insurrections to enlist all the parts of an oppressed population, as opposed to just young, able-bodied men, which is what the general participants in armed campaigns. So the significantly higher level of participation in nonviolent resistance involving ordinary people, young, old, men, women, workers, business, professionals, who are engaged in collective acts of civil disobedience and non-cooperation using the tactics that Erica mentioned. When you have large numbers of people involved in these types of campaigns, this exerts tremendous pressure against an opponent. So there's a direct correlation between the size of the participation and the amount of pressure asserted and the level of success. But we also found that the quality of the participation matters just as much as the quantity. So just amassing hundreds of thousands of people out on the streets is generally not sufficient to achieve success. What is critical in civil resistance is being able to win over key pillars of support, as Gene Sharp referred to them. These are the organizations and institutions in a society that afford the resources, skills, expertise that the regime or other power holder needs to maintain control. So critical often in these cases are the people that we often forget about, the professionals, the non-typical insurgents, the workers, the bureaucrats, civil servants, women, groups who provide a lot of manpower resources that regimes need to control a population. So that's the essence of the participation argument. And this basically quickly just shows the correlation between the level of participation and the success rate. We find that, when you have around 10 to 12% of the population participating in resistance, that tends to correlate with high success rates. If you get 15% of the population actively involved in the resistance, this is a very good indicator of success. So this is plotting out that evidence. So then, what affords a nonviolent resistance the ability to attract more participants? Well, the barriers to participation are far lower in nonviolent resistance compared to armed struggle. So, first of all, the physical barriers are lower. Participating in strikes, consumer boycotts, street theater, painting graffiti, all these sorts of things do not require strength, agility, or youth. Everyone can participate in these type of tactics. And there are lots of low-risk tactics involved in civil resistance. Gene Sharp is famous for his list of 198 methods. That list has undoubtedly expanded over the years, especially as we've had recent popular movements and revolutions. So there's lots that people can do in civil resistance compared to armed struggle. The commitment barriers are lower. So most people who engage in civil resistance campaigns are casual rebels. You have hardcore activists involved in any nonviolent movement, but most people who participate are, have day jobs. But this type of resistance allows for casual participation and accommodates varying levels of commitment compared to armed struggle, where you have to train, have, explosives, particular expertise in explosives and this sorts of things. So casual participation is more possible in nonviolent resistance. The informational barriers are lower in civil resistance compared to armed struggle. Even though some clandestine secret planning is necessary for unarmed insurgents, particularly in repressive environments, generally speaking, civil resistance relies less on underground organizing and activity and much more on above ground. So when you see large numbers of people protesting in the streets, demonstrating, this has tremendous demonstration effect, especially when acts, above ground acts, are publicized on various forms of media, social media and traditional media. And finally, the moral barriers and the cognitive barriers are lower for civil resistance. Most people are willing to die for a cause, willing to fight for justice, but they're unwilling to take up arms and kill people for it. So again, nonviolent resistance offers the means and wherewithal for people to participate who otherwise would not by taking up weapons. And so Erica's going to talk a little bit about the effects of civil resistance on a critical pillar of support, which is the security forces.
Right. So the question is, even if you can get 10% or 12% of the population in the streets participating, why does that give you so much leverage over the opponent? Well, what we find actually is a really interesting set of correlations between participation and the ability to produce security force loyalty shifts. Now, this really, the way that we came up with this mechanism really emerges out of research done by other people like Gene Sharp before us that suggests that there are pillars of support that every leader relies on to stay in power. And if those pillars of support, like security forces, bureaucrats, economic elites, state media, educational elites, if they stop cooperating with the regime leadership, the regime cannot stay in power. It cannot maintain the status quo. And what we find is that these nonviolent campaigns, particularly the ones that have the large membership, are much better able to achieve these loyalty shifts in the security forces than similarly sized violent campaigns. And the question is, why is that? Well, in our case studies, especially on Iran and the Philippines, what we find is that the more people participating, the more likely it is that those security forces are going to be really uncomfortable going home and facing their neighbors, who they recognized in the crowd earlier that day. It's just a simple kind of proportional issue that the more people you have participating in a campaign, the more likely it is that they're going to have relationships already established with those people that work in the pillars and are not isolated from the broader society. They recognize their kids, their students, their friends, their colleagues, and their customers in the crowd. And so in order to maintain their own livelihood in the long run, sometimes they decide to not really necessarily turn over to the other side, but maybe call in sick to work that day when they know they're going to get the order to shoot. And that's all that these movements sometimes need, is not for the military to come to their side, but just for them to not show up to work that day. So the question is, what happens when the regimes do repress, when they do actually solicit the support of the security forces? Well, this is one of those conditions under which most people are very skeptical about the ability of civil resistance to work. But what we actually find in our research is that almost all of the campaigns that we study, whether nonviolent or violent, are violently repressed by their opponents. And part of it is because of a selection issue. Our cases are made up of campaigns that are asking for maximal goals: regime change, anti-occupation, or secession. Almost all the time, those are going to be met with violent resistance by the state, trying to maintain the status quo. But even under these repressive circumstances, nonviolent campaigns are still outperforming violent ones by the similar rate. And the question is, why is that? Well, there are two reasons, and I'll talk about the first one and then give it back to Maria. With nonviolent campaigns, it's much more likely that repression will actually backfire. And backfire is a concept developed by a lot of people, and Brian Martin has a book called Backfire that's very useful, Dynamics of Backfire, and explaining this. But basically, what Martin argues is that one foundational necessary element to backfire is a sense of moral outrage. And what happens when repression happens against unarmed civilians is it sometimes produces a sense of moral outrage that ends up mobilizing more people than what the regime intended in the first place. So usually repression is meant to scare people not to show up. And in the case of backfire, it's counterproductive by making more people show up. So it can backfire domestically in that when you send your troops out to fire upon unarmed protesters for the 7th week in a row, all of a sudden you see them riding around on the shoulders of the protesters. So that would be an example of backfire. Another one might be international backfire, where there's a sort of a sense internationally that you've crossed the line, and then all of a sudden you find yourself being hauled up in front of the UN Human Rights Council and other things and being shamed. And even though it's very arguable as to whether these types of institutions or norms have really constraining effects, we live in times where these guys actually have to at least deal with them these days, where they didn't have to before. And so we make the argument that basically international pressures can kind of put a thorn in the side of many of the people that are opposing these groups.
And then, so the other issue is that, no regime, no matter how brutal, can maintain control over a population and can maintain power when a significant portion of the population, notably these key pillars, are engaged in acts of collective stubbornness. So when you have mass civil disobedience, when you have oil workers not showing up for work, businesses losing money because of consumer boycotts. This makes it very difficult, even for regimes that would want to use maximum force against protesters, to be successful. But an important point, and I know that this is also very important when we're interacting with activists and civil society groups around the world. The media tends to fixate only on street protests and demonstrations when they talk about peaceful resistance. And again, I personally may be, this may be a little extreme, but I think peaceful resistance is often a misnomer in the sense that many of these campaigns are highly disruptive, and they're meant to shatter sort of a peaceful status quo. So they're peaceful in the sense that they're not using violence, but they're often highly disruptive. And so, when you have, so it's an important point for these activists and civil society groups is the ability to alternate between methods of dispersion and methods of concentration. So there are lots more tactics available in the nonviolent arsenal than just street protests, demonstrations, sit-ins, that sort of thing. So these tactics that bring a lot of people together can be incredibly powerful. They're visually powerful, but they also leave people vulnerable to repression. When you have a lot of people coming together, makes them fairly easy targets for the regime. So often campaigns and movements that have been successful have been able to use these methods of dispersion. So again, which allows people to engage in acts of defiance without congregating and concentrating and making themselves vulnerable to repression. So consumer boycotts, stayaways, go slow tactics, strategic noncompliance at the workplace, forming parallel structures in institutions. These sorts of things, can be highly effective, but again, just don't leave people vulnerable to repression. So we found that, again, it just makes it, when you alternate in the campaigns that have been able to bring these different types of tactics together, this makes it very, very difficult for the regime to crack down effectively and successively on the movement. So then we found, generally speaking, the violent campaigns in our study were far more reliant on external forms of support for their success than nonviolent movements were. So the bottom line there is that because the nonviolent movements rely a lot more on their own skill sets, resources, their willingness to obey and cooperate, they're not as reliant on the outside for mass sums of money, obviously for weapons, and that sorts of things. Whereas armed groups are a lot more reliant on external supporters, be they state sponsors or other transnational groups, to be able to have the weaponry, the training, the funding necessary to achieve success. So we found, even though this is not to say that that external support is inconsequential for the success of nonviolent movements. Indeed, as Erica mentioned, sanctions, diplomatic sanctions, economic sanctions. You're all familiar with the famous boycott campaign during the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. So some of these types of sanctions can be very, very important in applying additional pressure on regimes, isolating them, alienating them. There are certain forms of technical consultations, trainings that can be very effective for activists, notably how to think strategically about your campaign. So this is an area where, say, the NGO community has an advantaged position in terms of being able to develop and disseminate knowledge and know-how about how to wage struggle effectively, but non-violently. But generally speaking, these groups are a lot less reliant on the whims of outsiders to achieve success compared to the violent campaigns.
So we're going to wrap it up by talking about the so what of the project. So first I want to talk about this question of, yes, there are some cases where we see violent resistance working, and indeed in about 25% of our cases of violent insurgency, we see them succeed. So lots of examples come to mind, the Russian Civil War, the Algerian anti-France occupation struggle, Vietnam, and some other key cases demonstrate that violent insurgency is sometimes effective. But the question is, at what cost? And so we took a look at a few different measures of this, and I'm going to talk about three today: conflict-related deaths, how many people die during the conflict, what are the prospects of democracy in the long term after the conflict is over, and what are the prospects for maintaining civil peace after the conflict is over. So this isn't in our book, but it's just a snapshot of some recent events. These are civilian conflict-related deaths during a variety of conflicts ongoing. In Tunisia, 2011, in the anti-Ben Ali struggle, there were 221 confirmed deaths so far. In Bahrain, there have been 54 confirmed deaths. We think the number is probably higher than that, but that's what external observers have confirmed. Syria, now we're up to about 5,000, probably another 1,000 on top of that, and several thousand in custody or detention. In Egypt, in the anti-Mubarak uprising through July, we saw 875 civilians killed. So again, these weren't bloodless conflicts. There are risks to civil resistance, but most of the violence is from the state side of things. In Yemen, we see about 1,800 deaths and growing. In Libya, of course, the rebels said that there were 50,000 deaths. A lot of official reports I've seen are more like 20,000, so I put 30,000 in there as sort of a more skeptical interpretation of civilian deaths. And then I put Syria in 1982. This is the Hama massacre, which occurred in over a 3-week period where Hafez Assad had surrounded Hama because of an armed Islamic insurgency that was threatening his hold there. And they just, fired cannons and shells at the town for 3 weeks and killed 40,000 civilians and displaced another 200,000. So these are sort of the costs of armed insurgency compared with the civilian deaths, even in horrible cases like Syria today, where 5,000 is a terrible figure, but it's nothing compared to the 40,000 that died in just 3 weeks in Hama. Now, this is looking at the prospects for democracy. And the way that we measured this is by looking at whether the country was a democracy, that is a +7 or higher if you're familiar with the Polity scale, on the Polity scale 5 years after the campaign had ended. And what you can see here is that when we control for the Polity score of the location during the conflict, that is, what are these countries when they're actually being fought by the either armed insurgents or the unarmed insurgents, you see that they're roughly the same when they're already really totalitarian regimes or monarchies. When they're at the low end of the Polity scale, they don't really have very good chances of turning into democracies. But you can see that as you move up the Polity scale, and particularly in this range of inocracies, which is the -5 to the 5, you see that if a country is a 5 and it faces a violent campaign, its likelihood of emerging as a democracy 5 years later is just over 20%. But if a country is a 5 on the Polity scale and it faces a nonviolent campaign, its chances are 70% or higher, and it goes up from there. In other words, your chances for becoming a democracy if you're facing a nonviolent campaign are much higher. And if you're familiar with Robert Putnam's work on social capital, this won't surprise you. His argument is basically that the more people get together and do stuff in their leisure time or even with political groups, the more engaged they are in politics, the better the democracy. Civil resistance is like social capital on steroids. It's like people doing democracy before democracy is actually being done to them. And then you have the case of post-conflict civil peace. And this is just the predicted probabilities that the country will relapse into civil war within 10 years of the end of the campaign. And we see that nonviolent campaigns are about 15% less likely to experience a relapse into civil war. In other words, on all three of these measures, how many civilians die, whether the country becomes a democracy, and whether the country has a relapse into civil war, we see nonviolent resistance outperforming them on all these consequences as well. So this leads us with a couple implications. In terms of scholarship, to me, it asks us scholars to sort of revise our notion of power as solely being construed as the monopoly on the use of force. Because as what we find out from this research and other research is that sometimes people can't use force even when they have a monopoly on paper. The actual exercise of force requires the consent of a lot of people, and that consent shouldn't always be taken for granted. The second thing is that it really changes the nature of the role of civilians in conflict. And if you do conflict or you do research on violent conflict, you know that the way we typically treat civilians is either as victims or resources to be plundered by either side. But we don't usually treat them as the actual agents of conflict. And I think this is asking scholars to take that much more seriously as a possibility. The third thing that it does for us as scholars is ask us to look again at the sort of structure-agency debate. Are these campaigns emerging as nonviolent because structures have made it possible for them to be nonviolent? Or are people creating structural opportunities by taking the action in the first place and forcing these openings to come about? These are empirical questions, which I really hope that people will take seriously and start studying in the future.
And then finally, from a policy perspective, I mean, there are obvious reasons why, both the fact that nonviolent campaigns tend to be far more effective than armed campaigns in achieving things like, transitions from authoritarianism and dictatorship, and that these campaigns and movements are more likely to result in democratic outcomes and are less likely to result in societies that relapse back into civil strife or civil war. This makes it an interesting finding, an area of knowledge for people both inside governments like the U.S. government, State Department, and certainly in the non-governmental field. And it's also important from a violent conflict prevention perspective. And certainly this is something that the State Department cares a lot about. So if you support people fighting for basic human rights and you support transition to democracy and democratic development, and you want to prevent massive loss of life and escalation of violent conflict, then thinking through very strategically and creatively about how to support nonviolent conflict is a worthy endeavor for policymakers. And so, lately I've been sort of heavily ensconced in Syria-related work, and I've been observing, for example, what our ambassador is doing in Damascus and has been doing in Syria, Ambassador Robert Ford, and he sort of, for me, epitomizes what great diplomats can do to help people engaged in nonviolent resistance against very repressive opponents. And he sort of, through his acts of solidarity with protests, marching with them, attending funerals, meeting with regime types at the same time that he's meeting with different opposition groups, calling out abuses, being there to bear witness, physical intervention in some of these places, being able to convene different opposition groups, being able to convene regime moderates with opposition groups. All these are very concrete things that political actors, notably out in the field, can do to help these nonviolent movements. And I think probably for those who are especially interested in this area, the best publication on this topic what is called the Handbook for Diplomats in Democratic Development Support, in Democracy Development Support. This is a product of the Community of Democracies, of which, of course, U.S. government is a member, and it sort of goes through and reveals all the tools available to policymakers, in democratic countries to assist campaigns, nonviolent campaigns and movements. And it also includes case studies of where these tools have been applied. So, these are the kind of publications that, I'm hoping become more and more mainstreamed at State Department and other places that offer, very concrete suggestions in ways that State Department, without being out in front and giving the perception of controlling these movements, which is obviously not the case. The domestic actors always determine the success, but just giving ways that we can support and help channel conflict in nonviolent directions. But I think this study was a start at convincing that it's important to do it and offers some ideas for how it can be done. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Excellent presentations. Floor is open for questions. Yes, in the back. Well, I'll let you guys do it then if you want.
Thank you. This is just extraordinarily interesting. Do you mind just getting a little bit more concrete for a few minutes and give us a couple of case examples that you looked at?
Okay, so we have 4 case studies in the book. We have 2 examples of successes, 1 and 2 failures. So we've got the Palestinian territories and the Iranian Revolution, the 78 and 79 one, as our Middle East cases. And then we've got the Philippines and Burma as our success and failure in Southeast Asia. And I'll talk about Iran very quickly, the 100 Days Revolution, because I think it epitomizes a lot of the dynamics that we've talked about here. So basically, what you see with the 100 Days Revolution is that you see a growing level of discontent in the country. And then all of a sudden you start seeing organization. You see coalitions being built among different groups within the society that are finding commonalities in their grievances against the Shah. And ultimately you start seeing mobilization. So you see mostly protests and demonstrations. Now, at the outset, these are repressed violently. There are over 3,000 people killed during the nonviolent 100 Days Revolution. And the regime repressed them, and so then it angered more people. It backfired. More people showed up, and it was actually somewhat similar to Syria in the sense that you were getting funeral processions that were also highly politicized as a result of the repression. But as Maria said, you know, if people just rely on things like demonstrations and protests day after day after day, this can become highly predictable. And two things happen. One is that the Shah's regime just learns how to go about its business and ignore the movement. And the second thing that happens is that they know exactly where the people are going to show up and when and what to do. So they surround them and shoot them, basically. So this is the way that it starts to go. And even though it angers people, it does raise the stakes and makes people more afraid. So the movement then was able to do what I think most of our successful movements do, which is diversify its methods to include ones of dispersion as well as concentration. So you started to then see the co-optation of the oil workers, which in this case ended up being crucial because for a lot of, especially the oil-rich regimes, the way that they're maintaining the loyalty of their pillars of support is by paying them with oil rents that are very direct income. So basically, the oil workers start to strike. And they did this by doing the stay-at-home strike, which is that they simply didn't go to work. Well, as we said, no regime can repress all of the people all the time, especially when it's a tactic that's highly dispersed, where to repress this, what they had to do and did was go door to door to every home and pull the oil workers out of their homes, march them back to the oil fields, and put them back to work. They worked at half pace. It's really hard to repress people working at half pace. So then they go home that day, and then the next day they don't show up to work. So the security forces go door to door, pull them out of their homes, and send them back to work where they work at half pace. So basically, what happens is that after a few days of this, the security forces know, first of all, I'm sick and tired of going into people's homes. I don't want to do that again. And second of all, I know that I'm not getting my paycheck this month because they're working half pace. And so it really reduces the credibility of the regime to actually deliver its promises to achieve the loyalty. So the security forces start defecting at this point. And ultimately, the economic elites get really uneasy about this. And after, not too long of this, a couple weeks, is when the Shah actually was removed from power. So basically, this was a huge victory, and it kind of plays out exactly as many other cases of nonviolent resistance work out. Another book that's very useful in describing these processes is Kurt Schock's book called Unarmed Insurrections. I think it's called Nonviolent Campaigns in Non-Democracies or something like that. And he really emphasizes this ability to maintain resilience in the face of regime repression by switching up your tactics, your methods of concentration and methods of dispersion.
But in all these cases, even in Iran, so we looked at the period both before the massive nonviolent part. So there were both, sort of Marxist-inspired and Islamist armed insurgencies that preceded the mass mobilization. And, we did, systematic research, interviewed a number of people who've done work on this area, found that these movements, these insurrections, they, attracted a lot of initial attention, media attention. They blew a lot of stuff up, all this kind of stuff, but failed to attract any type of significant participation by other groups in society. So we have that period that sets up, sort of what came end of 1978 by these like 5 or 10 years before that involved these armed insurgencies, which basically got nowhere, and the Shah was able to, slap them down pretty easily. But really what was decisive in Iran was when you had these critical pillars and ordinary people, the bazaris, the youth, the oil workers, who were all engaged in mass civil disobedience. And this is what really created pressure on the regime and ultimately forced it to step down. So we have that comparative part, actually in all of the case studies. The Palestinian Intifada is an interesting one. I actually looked at this case for my dissertation. I did some interviews with Palestinians involved in the first Intifada, which is, again, late 80s, 88 to early 90s. Interviewed some Israeli generals who were active in the territories during that time. And basically the bottom line with that case study is, the PLO had been involved in lots of different terrorist activities in the lead up to the first Intifada. Wasn't seeming to get them much anywhere, no support inside Israel for their aims. But the first 18 months of the first Intifada, which again involved a panoply of nonviolent tactics, from protests, strikes, banners, no taxation without representation, all these sort of classic tactics, did more in 18 months to advance Palestinian aims for self-determination than certainly the previous, 20 years, and certainly anything since. And so, having that rich interview data and having the perspective of Israeli soldiers and generals and the impact of being surrounded by mass numbers of women, youth, all this sorts of thing. And here was a classic case where it backfired. So the images on CBS News and elsewhere of Israeli soldiers, beating up unarmed protesters, didn't go over well. And it really ticked off, the Jewish American community and lots of folks here. But so this period was sort of the heyday of Palestinian resistance. And you compare that to the armed struggle before and after, and it's pretty startling. Burma, the same thing. The massive participation in 1988 following the stolen elections, where you had all these different groups. It forced two military dictators from power, but ultimately the movement got repressed, and a lot of the young people especially fled to the jungles to join the armed militias. At that point, the population was demobilized, very tough to regroup after the stolen elections to sort of, rally behind Aung San Suu Kyi. And Burma is also an interesting case where having a charismatic leader is not always decisive or determinative, and it sometimes can be debilitating if you rely too much on a charismatic leader as opposed to dispersing. Philippines, what was so critical in that case study, and I think about it a lot with Syria, was the business community. Having the Makati business group join the opposition when the economy started to tank, they started to support the nonviolent protests with funding, with manpower, all this kind of stuff. That, the Catholic Church, so involving, again, these normal mainstream pillars, which nonviolent movements are much more likely to achieve than armed movements, which there were in the Philippines as well. You had in Mindanao an Islamist insurgency, and you had a Marxist insurgency. Didn't get very far, certainly didn't win over the mainstream pillars, but when you get those pillars involved, it's generally game over for the regime.
Yes. Go ahead, right here. Sure. Yeah, in the brown jacket. Oh, sorry.
Hi, I'm Don Wolfensberger with the Wilson Center. Just two quick questions. One, is there a difference between civil disobedience and civil resistance? I noticed that Maria used them interchangeably and that Erica really didn't use the term civil disobedience. And is civil resistance considered to be more activist and disobedience maybe more passive? And the second question is, how would you classify Libya, which seemed to begin as civil resistance, and then when we sent in support to protect civilians against getting massacred, we ended up supporting a civil insurrection?
I'll take the second question and then let Maria take the first one. So I would classify Libya not as starting out with civil resistance at all. So people in the streets doing stuff does not a civil resistance campaign make. So there were a couple of days at the outset where people were in the streets doing stuff and calling for Gaddafi to step aside. But almost immediately, I mean, it got pretty out of hand. It was a lot of rioting. It was, they actually overwhelmed some of what some people here are calling mercenaries and others contest were mercenaries. They overwhelmed them and killed them kind of right in the third day of the uprising. And so I actually think that it wasn't actually tried in Libya to, as I said, to be sort of what I consider a civil resistance campaign. There has to be some kind of coordination of tactics, not just people kind of hitting the streets because they saw that happen in Egypt and they think that means that they can bring down their own guy. Now, that said, it's very notable that in those first 2 days of February 15 to 17 alone, we saw huge numbers of high-level people defecting from Libya, right? So it's almost like there was a preemptive expectation that a civil resistance campaign would emerge there by those people that left. And unfortunately, that's not the way it played out. And I think it's a combination of the fact that Gaddafi was kind kind of, doing the helicopter and the strafing of the crowds thing where several dozen people died. But it was also a function of the fact that the people themselves were using violence against the security forces, which I think is not really a popular thing to say, but that's how I would characterize that.
Yeah, and even I would just, say in Libya, there were nonviolent protests that took place at the beginning, but I think it was never. And once you had the armed insurgency that started and they knew they had the backing of NATO and a NATO Air Force, it's very hard at that point to go back and say, okay, how can we really organize, create, target the regime's center of gravity, pillars of support, and, go after it with nonviolent resistance once you have that dynamic. So it was very difficult. Although, and we also heard examples where right before the rebels then went from Benghazi to enter Tripoli, there were actually isolated campaigns of non-cooperation, refusals to show up at work, but this was like right as they were marching in. So it's tough to conceptualize this campaign as, having anything where civil resistance was decisive. But in terms of, and by the way, the resistance became obviously completely dependent on outside powers once they, started the armed struggle. But in terms of civil disobedience, civil resistance, they're often used interchangeably, although I would probably say that civil disobedience is much closer to non-cooperation in the sense that it's more one of the categories of civil resistance, whereas civil resistance is sort of the full gamut of activities that campaigns, movements can employ. Nonviolent, Gene Sharp again had like 198 with 3 categories: protest and persuasion, non-cooperation, and nonviolent intervention. And I think the disobedience, when people are actively engaged in non-cooperation, that's more of a tactical element. Whereas, for example, wearing symbols and humor and, creating, underground medical clinics and political structures, it's a type of not obeying, but it's not the classic forceful disobedience that, say, a strike or a boycott would be. So I think one is more tactical. Civil resistance is sort of the full Monty and all of the various methods available to a movement.
Yeah, in the back.
Hi, Lisa Shirk with 3P Human Security, and I've been teaching strategic nonviolence for the last 20 years, and the question that I've been interested in is what is the influence of different campaigns on each other? So, for example, you can trace the movie Gandhi and its influence in Chile, for example. People watched the film, said, hey, we can do this here. Have you looked at this sort of what is the training and the capacity building that allows for a strategic level of nonviolent resistance to happen? My question today is, why is the Occupy Wall Street movement seemingly not taking into account much of what we know about strategic nonviolence and planning and tactic, all this kind of thing? So it's obviously accessible to Americans, and it's been taught in many universities, but it hasn't influenced this civil resistance campaign in this country. Have you looked at what are those factors, again, that allow sort of a chaotic protest to move to a strategic nonviolent plan?
Start. I was actually thinking as I was walking by the Occupy today that this would have been ideal to invite their crews in, or at least their leaders. I mean, because it's, they've done some actually pretty impressive stuff. And, the thing is, I'm not as harsh as some people in terms of why don't they have a strategy? Why don't they have a 5-point plan? And, that's ideal. That usually takes campaigns and movements more than a couple months to develop. And when you're dealing with a campaign that does have diverse goals, they sort of know that they're focused on the negative influence of money in politics, and they know they're trying to achieve greater economic, parity within the population. But I think, something like this takes time to develop, and I think the leadership recognizes that they do need to strategize. I think some of them are very well versed in a lot of this material. They've seen the movies like A Force More Powerful, Bringing Down a Dictator, all these things, so they're aware of tactics, but just the ability to pull different groups together to come up with, a set of common goals is, like the hardest thing to do, I think, in any campaign or movement. And I remember just talking with our Serbian friends who were involved in the nonviolent ouster of Milosevic, and they would often say that more than 60% of the nonviolent resistance involved unifying the opposition. And so it's a huge challenge for all these campaigns and movements. So I don't know, maybe we'll see how it plays out with Occupy. And I probably wouldn't name a movement after a tactic. It was sort of like the global war on terrorism. weird, occupy is one tactic among many, so they may want to think about sort of, coming up with a better title for that. But so in terms of learning, anecdotally, we have cases that abound about, and not only recently with Arab Spring and Egyptians that learned and, oh, by the way, trained with the Serbian and Ukrainian and Georgian youth, because that did happen, especially for the Egyptians who were the most cosmopolitan, well-traveled, similarly for the Lebanese. And so you have a lot of these examples. Gene Sharp's From Dictatorship to Democracy, the Arabic version, has been seen by lots and lots and lots of Arab youth, especially involved in these movements. The Arabic version films, A Force More Powerful, Bringing Down a Dictator, shown on Al Jazeera. People saw it. They saw what people have done in other places. But, even before the contemporary period, we have, anecdotes of Central and Eastern Europe in the early 80s. And they would approach, our diplomats, and they would be witnessing what was happening, in the Philippines in '86. They're like, how did it happen? Can it happen here? So the interest was there. But I think what is different now is that you have these visuals, you have case examples, you have the documentaries, you have organizations that do trainings in strategic nonviolent action. So there's a lot more moving around. But I don't think there's been a systematic study of the learning effects. And I actually think it would be a neat study to do.
And we're actually doing that.
Oh, see,
so I'll get back to you if you give me your information afterward. I think Rob had a question.
I think this is an outstanding presentation, and so the way in which scholarship can be policy relevant. And kind of arising from your talk, I mean, if you're, in academic terms, if your independent variable is kind of conditions where it works, right? I guess in academia would be the dependent variable that strikes me as being the critical one is regime character, and getting a read on the character of the regime, these pillars of support, the core constituencies, and conditions under which these core constituencies will develop a calculus of interest that they'll start flipping. That a big part of the campaign in Libya was trying to external powers, the Secretary of State Clinton saying to the regular army and ministries, like, flip to the other side, and trying to sort of shift the calculus. And I think this structure agency debate, which is sort of a scholarly framed question, really is the key driver of whom and how to support. And I think one issue for further study would be dogs that didn't bark, like highly repressive societies. I mean, if there were a civil disobedience movement in North Korea, I really would don't think that would have a happy outcome. And Bob Jervis's new book on why intelligence fails. Have you looked at that? The CIA thing and how, as violent as the demonstration phase was, the CIA thought, well, he could have ramped up enormously with a crackdown, whether the army would have followed the order or not, and that Jervis points out that the failure of the Shah to really crack down massively was viewed as an indicator of regime stability by the CIA. They were operating from the assumption, hey, if it's bad, the Shah will crack down. If he's not massively cracking down beyond what you mentioned that accounts for the 3,000, things must be pretty stable. And I guess that really brings us to okay, we've done Libya, and why not Syria? And I think there's a real moral hazard argument for the State Department to get people, Hungary 56, what happened to the Shiites in 91, to say, okay, guys, rise up. And then Assad, you haven't had a tipping point where within the regime yet, it may come, where it could lead to a lot of people being killed. That's, I recall a conference where they said, no comments, just questions, and Stanley Hoffman, made a long comment and then said his question was, what do you think of what I just said? So anyway, I'd be interested because I think it's really fascinating, but it's a hard, and it ain't just social science. Like, how do you respond to the Syrian movement now?
Right. So in terms of, I just want to touch on one thing because it comes up a lot about, are there regimes where nonviolent resistance can't work? So North Korea, would we see a civil resistance come out of North Korea and win? And I don't think so today. I also don't think we could see a successful armed insurgency in North Korea, right? I mean, I think that there are lots of places where, and what the real empirical question is, which needs to be studied, is, are there places where armed conflict works, where a well-planned, well-executed civil resistance couldn't work? And we need to do a lot of counterfactual analysis to figure that out. But myself, starting out as a skeptic, I'm now wondering that myself, that are these armed insurgencies ever truly going to outperform what a well-planned, well-executed civil resistance could do. And in terms of the question of, regime characteristics, that's really sort of the next project, which is unpacking which types of regimes are more vulnerable to this, which types of militaries, conscription militaries, given the mechanisms we talked about, are probably more vulnerable to these dynamics than sort of ethnically rewarded militaries and that sort of thing. So we've got a lot of different characteristics that we're now unpacking and taking a look at. And it's very interesting because just from the cases, we know that it's a very diverse set of regimes that has lost to these, and an equal set of them has succeeded in putting them down. So more will be revealed, I guess. And then I actually totally agree with you with the moral hazard issue, except that, today, I think it works in a very interesting way, which is more like how Alan Cooperman talks about it, which is what we've shown, even with things like R2P and everything, is that we'll intervene to support a group after it's armed itself and is already prosecuting an armed insurgency. But to my knowledge, I don't think we've ever intervened as the international community to support a civil resistance campaign, right? It's almost always after there's already an armed struggle going on. And I think part of that is because when we see the armed struggle going on, we think, okay, everybody's exhausted their last resorts and this thing's going to get really bad. And it's true. More civilians die during armed conflict. But at the same time, there are people who do also feel like they've exhausted everything, and they're not willing to use armed struggle. And so the question arises, is it ever a good idea to be more forceful and intervening to support people before they have to feel like they have to escalate to armed struggle and therefore kill a lot of people?
Yeah.
And that's like totally an open question.
But no, and just on the moral hazard really quickly, because I take this to heart and seriously. I did when I was working for the NGO, and I certainly do now working in government. We would never go anywhere around the world and encourage groups to, yes, tomorrow you should go out into the streets and use nonviolent protest. No, the selection of tactics and the choices that are made have to come from the local group. They know the risks involved. They know when it's too risky to meet with diplomats, for example. So we really, in all of these cases, have to defer, to the local activist groups and organizations, which is not to say that showing solidarity and recognizing the resistance is a bad thing. It can be, very helpful. But I think there's a moral hazard as well in, suggesting that we're only going to, take your campaign and movement seriously when you take up weapons. Especially if the armed resistance is more likely to result in a lot of people dying. So I think there are hazards involved in both. But if your starting place is that you are recognizing that the decisions are made by the local population, you're not giving tactical advice, but you're supporting and showing solidarity, you're behind a movement, not in front of it, then I think you're on safer ground.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Eric Picard at USAID, Office of Democracy and Governance, and spent a lot of time defending and promoting the legal environment for civil society around the world. And I'm just wondering what you think about the way the enabling environment for civil society in these countries that you're looking at changes the dynamic, makes it, relatively more easy for a movement to get going or not. I think it gets back to the discussion you just had. And when I look at the way governments regulate or control freedom of association, freedom of assembly, and at the moment we're seeing more restrictions kicking in around the world. Governments are passing laws and making regulations to clamp down. They seem to be sharing worst practices. I'm just wondering, how those caveats factor into your thinking.
So in terms of, I'll talk about the regime learning part, actually, which is very interesting, which is to say that we know that there are regimes that actually do exchange worst practices with one another explicitly and on paper. So there's been this very interesting diffusion effect, not just of civil resistance, but of effective repression of civil resistance. If you're interested in the textbook manual of the how-to, you need look no further than two American political scientists, Bruce Brennan de Mesquita and Alastair Smith, whose book, The Dictator's Handbook, just came out last month. And they talk about basically how dictators stay in power in the face of these massive threats. And basically the toolbox looks like this. you don't have to use too much repression. Just use the scariest type of repression you can find and terrorize people into staying home, so you don't have to spread out your resources and rely on them for too long. The second thing is figure out a way to be able to keep paying them. So the oil-rich countries are going to be less vulnerable to these things than others, and I think we see that playing out in the data. And then another thing is that divide and rule. So figure out a way to make the opposition argue among itself, break off into small pieces. It'll do to just make them disagree about methods, violent or nonviolent, or it'll do to make them disagree about what their goals are. Either one works, right? And stoking any type of sectarian conflict, that's terrific. There's no mistake that Assad has been emphasizing the sectarian and confessional divisions from the very start, saying that that's, what's going to happen is that Syria is going to devolve into this disgusting sectarian civil war, which, he's trying to make a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way by saying they exist before they did. So anyway, I think that's sort of the dictator's handbook, and I'll let you refer to the civil society
quickly,
stuff.
so the level of repression obviously affects what type of tactics you use and how much planning needs to take place underground in secrecy as opposed to above ground. It's amazing, though. Activists find ways to communicate with each other and to plan even in incredibly repressive environments, which is why I may differ a little bit with Erica on the whole North Korea thing, because I don't think it's absolutely impossible to conceive of civil resistance actually. When it starts, if it were to start, I think it would rapidly erode the regime's pillars of support. But again, it's actually having a start place. But there are fissures in all of these dictatorships, all of them. And it's not clear at the outset, but once these campaigns and movements start, then it becomes obvious where those fissures were. But also, I would commend to you Michael Glennon and Peter Ackerman's work on the legal basis of supporting civil resistance campaigns and movements. They've done some good work in applying international law, including human rights law, applying the International Covenant on Civil Political Rights, and things that all these governments sign on to basically make the case that the types of support we're talking about for nonviolent movements, we're not talking about conspiracies, we're not talking about weapons, we're talking about things like helping them communicate with each other. We're talking about providing them with educational materials. We're talking about giving them the means to buy placards and T-shirts. And so and this is where the Diplomat's Handbook that I mentioned earlier also looks at the international legal basis for supporting nonviolent activists and movements. So for your work on this, I really recommend both of those to you.
I wonder whether you just about, do I need a thing? Can you hear me? Thank you. There are governments, Herbert Weiss, Woodrow Wilson. There are governments that badly need their populations because of economic. There are governments that don't need them at all. And they can defend themselves by purchasing mercenaries. That whole trajectory, it seems to me, wasn't really taken into account in the short review of your research, which I applaud and which is particularly interesting to me because I'm an expert on the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is about to blow up. And so I'm sort of thinking, how many hours away are we from some of the things that you are talking away, quite literally? But I think that is one of the big problems of the catalog of regime. There's a real division, as I see it, between societies where the people produce the wealth and societies who don't need the people.
I think, your point about mercenaries is a very good one. This is a really tough obstacle, challenge for nonviolent movements to overcome. Because for one thing, if you're a regime that relies heavily on foreign fighters, the ability of the nonviolent activists to effect loyalty shifts within the ranks of the security forces is obviously very difficult. But even in these cases, so the question mark becomes, how does the regime, what is its economic basis? So beyond these mercenaries, what are its pillars of support? And would it be possible to target these pillars both inside the country and, oh, by the way, if these mercenaries are coming from other countries, what can be done to extend the nonviolent battlefield to those countries where you have the mercenary soldiers to embarrass, put pressure on the regimes, whatever. So the nonviolent resistance doesn't necessarily have to be confined to the country or the area where the repression is directly, but could also be extended. But I think it is a tough case. I thoroughly acknowledge that this is probably the toughest area where civil resistors would have to be able to find creative ways to think about other ways to erode the pillars of support.
I want to mention one thing too, because you brought up about trouble spots where there seems to be this recurrence of armed conflict. And one thing that I accidentally fell upon was the phenomenon of that there are occasionally cases where unarmed civilians rise up against non-state armed groups in civil resistance and non-cooperation in places where they feel like they're being governed by rebels or something like that. And there have been these peace communities that have come around in Colombia, for instance, in the 90s. They're kind of like dry counties, except instead of no booze, it's no violence. And Lebanon, during the Lebanese Civil War, there were cases of this. During the Algerian Civil War, there were cases of this in the 90s. And in Afghanistan today, there's some stuff developing against Taliban rule. So I think that this is actually a really underexplored area, is how do civilians try to take control of armed conflict situations themselves when they don't want to be in the crossfire, and how can they try to cast off that violence? And it's very difficult to get leverage in situations like that, but people try to do it. It's very interesting.
Why don't you just collect the last three
Great.
questions and then just collect some and then have a final comment each. How's that?
Okay. If we can't get to you, oh, sorry.
just
Okay.
start
I'll just go around the horn.
Yeah.
Way to bring it all together.
Michael Shodipo.
We're almost out of time, so
Okay. Michael Shodipo, Peace Initiative Network, Nigeria. Mine is more, I want to commend you for a very brilliant presentations, both of you. But mine is more of a question, comment than question, but I know it will also end up being a question. Have you considered the issues at this event in Nigeria, whereby we see issue of armed resistance being successful in? Let me give you the scenario, like in the Niger Delta region of Nigeria, though the process started as a non-violent resistance, but after the government, rolling on tanks, killing people, the people had to take up arms, and at the end of the day, it was a success because it produced the present government we have now, in presence of our present government, and that's more reason why we also have in the north now, in northern Nigeria, we have the Islamic militant, taking up arms because of the lessons from the south, because they were able to take up arms and they were able to achieve their aims and objectives. And finding out the Islamic militant in the north also taking up arms in order to also achieve their own objectives. So in your studies, do you consider issues in Nigeria, and how do you see it? What is your comment?
Great.
Hi, I really enjoyed your presentation. I have the inevitable social media question, and just to what extent do you think that social media either enables or dilutes nonviolent movements and everyone that is basically social media evangelicals? Is that a trend, or is that something that is here to stay?
Hi, my name's Orly Rabin from Friends of the Earth Middle East, and I'm actually living in Israel right now, and we had, just as there was the Arab Spring, there's been the Israeli summer. Mm-hmm. And my question is on time. I'd really love to see some change happen from the Israeli summer, or Tentifada, or whatever you want to call it. How long do we have to wait? What is the average time span of most of these uprisings? How long do you have to wait to call it a success? Because a lot of people in Israel are having that similar question. Thank you.
John Iskander from State Department Foreign Service Institute. The question is about why you all think the movements succeed when they do, since like if you look at Egypt, obviously there's been a zillion movements that have been peaceful, mobilization efforts along all kinds of different lines that have happened over, well, even if we just take the decade of the 2000s, that there's been all kinds of things. Or in Iran, you have, you know, concerted efforts by Marxists, by Islamists, etc., some of which were peaceful, but why do they succeed when they do in the cases that you've studied?
Hi, my name is Zach Ritter, and I was actually in correspondence with you, Erica. Thank you for the book. It was very interesting. When I read through it, I have two questions. First, and I think this is very important for me as I work through my own dissertation, which is on similar issues. What is a regime, and what constitutes regime change? Let's use the case of Egypt. Was that a regime change when Mubarak left? What's going on now? Is that part of the same nonviolent resistance, or is this a second one? How would you operationalize that? Furthermore, what is South Ossetia now? Is that a case of regime change or effort for regime change? It's something that could be called a democratic revolution. Not really. So that's another question. And second, having read through the book, it seems that you guys are leaning more towards the agent side than the structure side. Do you believe you've exhausted the structural variables that are important? It doesn't sound from the talk like you think you have. And for instance, when I read through the book, I was very unsatisfied with using polity instead of something like coercive capital or something else, Levitsky way, for instance. So those are my questions.
Great. Well, from the old arms control days, that's a sort of MERV set of questions for you,
Right.
so you can go ahead.
I'll take the one on first, how long do we have to wait? The average nonviolent campaign takes 3 years to run its course. The average violent campaign takes 9 years to run its course. So if you haven't done it for 3 years in a coordinated, disruptive way, you're not done yet.
Yeah, but Israel's a social justice movement, so
Yeah, so these are for those 3 types of demands. So, but you can... Yeah, we cannot confirm nor deny that these inferences would apply to that case. But there's
also calls for political change within the social justice movement.
Right.
And that is a primary goal.
Right.
A large part of the social justice.
Yeah, and I would say I don't necessarily see good reason to say that these things wouldn't apply to different types of campaigns too, right? So we just can't make a definitive number outside of those types of goals. In terms of the social media one, so the interesting thing is that when you have technology that's available openly to anyone, it's as available to states as it is to civilians, right? And so what we actually see as part of the dictator's toolbox, if you want to call it that, is that they've actually become, I think, much more adept at using these types of technologies at this point than activists. In fact, there's some really great examples in Sudan and other places where the regimes have actually used them to trap people by posting fake, very, very provocative and clever protest event sites where 17,000 people RSVP to it. And so then the first people who show up get rounded up, tortured, and they get all they need is their password. As soon as they have the Facebook password, they can find out who everybody else is too, right? So it's actually, the key, as with any strategy, is never over-rely on a single source, especially one that can be highly vulnerable to repression or used by the other side. So it's kind of like in World War I, watching generals send people over the top every day for 4 years. You know, it becomes very predictable, not very disruptive, and the line doesn't move very much, right? So the key is to sort of diversify the methods of communication and to sort of stay on the offensive, one step ahead, rather than relying on the same predictable method. Zach, I want to talk a little bit to your questions. You mentioned what constitutes regime change. I mean, in our definition, what it is if they actually removed, you know, the government that they targeted. So I think, you know, if you'd asked me, like in April, I would have said that the Egyptian revolution is a success, right? And I actually still sort of think that, because I don't think there was any way that anybody, including Mubarak himself, thought he was leaving until the day he left, right? And there was just no way the guy was going to leave until the day he left. And so that is just something that wasn't going to occur one way or the other. And so what we tried to do in our book is we tried to distinguish between the movement achieving, like getting rid of Mubarak, versus what happens after that, 5 years after. So it could be one of those cases where Egypt is a successful regime change followed by a relapse into authoritarianism. It looked more like Iran, the Iranian Revolution, right? So we tried to distinguish the sort of short-term outcome and the long-term consequence, which is very unsatisfying, but it's the best we could do at the time. And then in terms of the structure and agency stuff, I mean, I think this gets to this gentleman's question about why we think movements succeed when they do. And the thing is that's so unsatisfying about lots of structural variables is that they're totally static, at least the way we code them. So they don't change much over time. Like if you're on Enlightened, mountains are mountains. They don't move and change. So we know where conflict happens, but not when. And I think that's what the skills help to explain. When people suddenly learn how to do it, that's when we see it, right? So in Egypt, you see multiple different iterations of this anti-Mubarak stuff happening in the early and mid-2000s. And what it was is a couple of failed nonviolent campaigns where they learned a ton and then used that knowledge in 2011. And in fact, a lot of the guys that were doing the organizing in 2011, I mean, they learned things as mundane as, let's make sure we have porta potties in Tahrir Square so that people stay. What do people need to participate? They need somewhere to go to the bathroom. These are like lessons learned from previous failed campaigns. And so one thing that's really important to note is that...
Did Mubarak give an order, crack down, and
he
was
did,
disobeyed?
absolutely, multiple times. Yeah. So, and so did Ben Ali, by the way. Mm-hmm. So basically, we know that that people that are engaged in these processes are agents of change. I mean, you sort of, things diffuse in terms of region, like they're spreading, the knowledge is spreading and stuff, but somebody has to be out there spreading it. And so the key thing that I'm trying to emphasize here is that just because a nonviolent campaign fails doesn't really mean that the story's over. Because if people survive, they usually survive with a ton of new experience that can be brought to bear later.
Right, and that ties to the unanswered question about Nigeria. The Ogoni movement is a fascinating one. Lots of nonviolent resistance was used. Ultimately, a failed campaign. The question to ask is, why did the movement fail? What groups needed to be brought into the fight who were not? How could, different tactics have been used in that area, which is a very fascinating one from a civil resistance perspective. So I think those are the key questions that you would want to ask in order to get a fuller answer to your question. But then, and in terms of social media, the media part, it allows you to communicate all that, go around regime repression, but ultimately, what is decisive is the ability of people to go from the virtual to the actual. So moving from the virtual realm, the venting, the organizing, blah, 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 to actually going to the streets, engaging in, boycott, strikes, civil disobedience, so the action part. But certainly, I mean, I would argue that I think social media has revolutionized civil resistance campaigns and movements, and it is here to stay. But as Erica pointed out, it's a tit for tat with the regimes, and they know what they're doing too. I'm much more along when it comes to structure agency. I'm really not in one camp or the other, and I think what we try to do with the book, although we do lean more towards the agency side, is much more focus on the Kurt Schock approach, which is the iterative aspect of structure and agency. You can't talk about agency without talking about how they relate to the structures they're in. And, when you're planning a civil resistance campaign and you're developing a pillars of support analysis, you have to have that structural analysis. That's like fundamental to it. Determining tactics, which ones are going to work? Well, you got to know how the regime is going to respond. Where are the splits between the police and the army, between the Praetorian units and the others? And so these structural elements really, really matter. But I think what's frustrating, you know, for someone who was, you know, writing about civil resistance when people are like, you know, what are you doing? It's like, you know, these regimes will never change in the Middle East, you know, because X, Y, and Z, GDP, you know, they're oil rich, blah, 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 blah. And so, and I remember at the time I was editing a book on civil resistance in the Middle East and all the campaigns and movements, and it was called Civilian Jihad. The book came out before Arab Spring, so now when I go back and redo this book, I can actually add all of the further cases that I've taken out, because it's too constraining, this structural determinist perspective. But I think we're on much safer ground if we acknowledge that the structural perspective is valid, and it's how agents interact and shape these structures. And then I've got to go.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for a great presentation.
Thank you, everyone.